Hey guys, tonight we begin in a city that technically did not exist anymore for nearly 4,000 years. A place buried under dust, a place of silence and time, a place where streets once echoed with merchants, potters, children and cattle carts, before the earth itself apparently decided it had other plans. So tonight, we're wandering slowly into the mystery of the Harappan civilization, or the Indus Valley civilization, if we're being formal and scholarly, which historians love. Nothing says excitement like pottery classifications and drainage systems. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these sleepy little journeys. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. Somewhere out there, somebody is hearing this while stuck in traffic or under a blanket. Now dim the lights a little, maybe turn on a fan, get comfortable, and let's drift back almost 5,000 years to a civilization that was advanced, organized, and still capable of completely disappearing like a magician who forgot to explain the trick. The story begins long before anyone called it Harappan. Back then, around 3300 BCE, the northwestern regions of the Indian subcontinent were alive with villages. Small farming communities rested beside rivers that no longer fully exist today. Rivers that shifted, dried, or simply vanished into geological confusion. The people grew wheat and barley. They raised cattle. They made pottery with geometric designs. They traded beads and copper tools. Slowly, these villages began turning into cities. Real cities. Actual urban centers with planning. This is where the Harappans become strangely modern. While many ancient civilizations loved giant monuments to kings, the Harappans seemed oddly practical. No gigantic statues screaming, "Look how powerful I am." Instead, drains. Beautiful, neat, organized drains. The Harappans thought, you know what people really need? Proper wastewater management. Their cities were astonishingly organized. Streets crossed at right angles, houses connected to drainage systems. Public baths existed. Granaries stored food carefully. It was less glorious empire of divine kings and more highly competent city council, which somehow feels even more impressive. One of their greatest cities was Harappa. Another was Mohenjo-daro, a name that translates to Mound of the Dead, a buried city waiting patiently. Imagine arriving there around 2500 BCE, the sun rising over baked brick buildings, merchants arranging goods, copper tools clinking softly, dust drifting through streets. The Harappans were organized to an unsettling degree. Their bricks were standardized across cities hundreds of miles apart, truly impossible, and yet they managed. Trade flourished too. Harappan beads and seals have been found in ancient Iraq. Mesopotamian records mention a mysterious trading partner called Meluha. The civilization was larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, but they don't dominate movies because they left behind no giant conquering kings. Their writing system still has not been deciphered. Thousands of seals survive with symbols and animals, unicorns, bulls, elephants, but nobody understands the meaning. Around 1900 BCE, something began going wrong, not all at once. The decline appears slower, stranger, more unsettling. Cities began emptying. This is where earthquakes enter the story. The Indus Valley region sits near zones of tectonic instability. The Indian plate continues pushing northward. Imagine living in a thriving city. Your family has lived there for generations. Then one day the ground shakes, walls crack, wells dry strangely, a river changes course, and suddenly the civilization built around that river begins slowly suffocating. Not from invasion, but from geography quietly betraying everyone. At Mohenjo-daro, archaeologists found evidence of repeated flooding. Layer after layer of silt buried sections of the city. People rebuilt, then flooding came again. Without reliable crops, cities weaken, trade suffers, political systems strain, people migrate. The great machine of civilization begins quietly coming apart gear by gear. When archaeologists rediscovered them in the 1920s, they had been forgotten for millennia. An entire civilization had once flourished, and history had forgotten it. Advanced sanitation suggests a society deeply invested in civic order. They built carefully and patiently, and still nature may have erased them piece by piece. Evidence exists of sudden destruction in some settlements: tilted walls, fractured foundations, abandoned structures. The Harappans depended on balance, and balance is fragile. Tonight, as we drift deeper, picture one final evening: a warm wind moving through narrow streets, oil lamps flickering, someone grinding grain, children falling asleep beside brick walls that had stood for generations, and somewhere beneath them, the earth quietly moving. Morning arrived slowly over the Indus cities, not with trumpets, not with dramatic prophecy, just sunlight warming brick walls one gentle layer at a time. A baker opened his workshop. Somewhere nearby, someone swept dust from a courtyard into the street, where it would end up in those famously efficient Harappan drains. The drains deserve admiration. While Rome gets praise for aqueducts, Harappans ensured wastewater went somewhere useful 2,000 years earlier. Quietly iconic behavior. The city stirred carefully awake. Carts rolled across baked earth. Goats wandered where they should not have been. Humanity domesticated goats thousands of years ago, and they became everyone's ongoing problem forever. Some things never change. In the marketplace, merchants prepared goods. Beads carved from carnelian glowed deep orange in the morning light. Pottery stood stacked in rows. Cotton cloth moved between hands. Copper tools clinked softly against wooden tables. And overhead, birds circled lazily through warm air drifting from the river. The river was everything. Rivers were not scenery. They were survival. Water fed crops. Crops fed cities. Cities created trade, craftsmanship, and social order. Take away the river, and the whole machine begins coughing politely before collapsing. The Harappans understood rivers intimately. Their civilization stretched across waterways. The mighty Indus dominated, while others spread life. Fields depended on annual flooding patterns. Predictability is comforting. Civilizations adore predictability. Humans love believing tomorrow will behave roughly like today. And for centuries it mostly did. Harvest followed flood. Trade followed harvest. Life continued. Children grew into adults who inherited homes built from the same standardized bricks their grandparents once stacked carefully under hot skies. Stable, orderly, almost suspiciously functional, because ancient history is usually chaos wrapped in linen, but the Harappans feel strangely calm. Their cities lacked obvious palaces. No giant temples dominate the skyline the way they did in ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. Who ruled these cities? Kings, councils, priests, some terrifyingly organized committee obsessed with sanitation? Nobody knows, and the civilization refuses to explain itself because its script remains undeciphered. They are like a quiet person who refuses to speak. We stare at their seals constantly, tiny engraved objects made from steatite. Animals appear: bulls, elephants, rhinos, and that mysterious unicorn. Short sequences, tiny fragments of language trapped forever behind silence. Scholars debate meanings, but the symbols remain unread. But while scholars debated, the actual Harappans were dealing with immediate concerns. Little signs of instability had begun appearing. A flood arrives slightly stronger than expected. A well produces less water. One farming season proves unreliable. Then another. Maybe rumors spread. The river is changing, which would have sounded absurd. Rivers don't just leave. except sometimes they do. Modern studies suggest tectonic shifts altered river systems. Earthquakes could have redirected waterways or disrupted glacial-fed systems. Imagine waking before sunrise, stepping outside. The air feels oddly dry. The riverbank looks different, water levels lower than they should be. Entire civilizations have collapsed because people kept insisting obvious disasters were temporary inconveniences. Meanwhile, nature was loading another update. At some settlements, earthquakes damaged structures. Walls cracked, buildings shifted, floors tilted strangely. Floods make visual sense. Storms announce themselves. But earthquakes come from below. The ground itself betrays you. One moment your home feels permanent. The next, the earth reminds everyone that permanence is mostly an emotional support illusion. A civilization does not need one fatal wound. Sometimes exhaustion is enough. Imagine rebuilding after floods, repairing cracked walls. Eventually, people begin leaving, not dramatically, quietly. One family moves toward more reliable farmland. Another abandons a damaged district. The city shrinks one empty house at a time. That's how great places usually die, not with explosions, with absence. At Mohenjo-Daro, streets rose higher as new construction layered atop old destruction. Each layer represents ordinary people trying to continue. History talks about civilizations abstractly, but actual humans still had breakfast, still argued about chores, still worried about sick children. One theory suggests the weakening monsoon system also contributed. Reduced rainfall would have devastated agriculture across already stressed regions. Floods, drying rivers, earthquakes, changing climate. That is an exhausting combination. Civilization begins feeling less eternal under those conditions. When nature becomes unpredictable, anxiety spreads. People lose confidence. Migration becomes more appealing if neighboring regions appear safer. Populations gradually shifted toward the Ganges basin. Not everybody died. The civilization transformed. Urban centers weakened while rural communities persisted. Real history rarely provides dramatic endings. Instead, you get centuries of gradual adaptation while historians try to simplify everything. Some sites show evidence of abrupt destruction. At Kalibangan, signs suggest the settlement may have been abandoned suddenly following seismic activity. Imagine standing there during the shaking. Storage jars falling, brick walls groaning, people rushing outside into choking dust. And afterward, silence. Rivers wandered unpredictably. The Gagga-Hakra system, linked to the legendary Saraswati, appears to have diminished significantly over time. Water disappeared from regions that once depended on it. Cities built for abundance suddenly faced scarcity. That transition changes people, maintenance weakens, public systems deteriorate. The famous drains perhaps clogged more frequently now. The drains stopped draining. Yet even in decline, craftsmanship remained. Bead makers still worked. Potters still shaped designs. Artisans continued routines inherited across generations. Human beings are remarkably persistent. Someone still baked bread while cities emptied. Someone still swept dust from a doorway. And eventually, silence settled. Not immediately. Just slowly enough that nobody realized they were living through the end of an age. No final speech. No clear last day. Just ordinary people adapting quietly until one day the city no longer functioned as a city at all. The wells dried, the markets faded, the houses emptied, wind moved through abandoned streets once kept perfectly ordered, and beneath everything, the earth continued shifting patiently in the dark. For a long time, Mohenjo-Daro carried a reputation as one of history's great unsolved disasters, partly because archaeologists love mysteries, and partly because humans in general become deeply excited whenever ancient skeletons appear unexpectedly. especially if those skeletons are lying in streets. The early excavators at Mohenjo-Daro uncovered human remains scattered in different areas. Some skeletons appeared awkwardly positioned. A few seemed to have died suddenly, and almost immediately, people began imagining catastrophe, which, to be fair, is a very human reaction. Nobody discovers ancient bones and calmly says, perhaps these individuals experienced a perfectly ordinary sequence of events. No, we invent apocalypses instantly. By the mid-20th century, dramatic theories flourished. Some proposed invasion, others imagined massacres. One theory even suggested ancient nuclear warfare, because every mysterious sight eventually attracts someone determined to blame alien technology or forgotten superweapons. Human imagination remains undefeated. But the actual evidence turned out to be far quieter and far sadder. The skeletons at Mohenjo-Daro likely accumulated gradually over time. Many were buried poorly or left exposed because the city's social systems had already weakened. That detail matters because it suggests a society slowly losing its ability to maintain normal civic order. And honestly, there's something deeply eerie about that kind of decline. Not dramatic destruction, just systems quietly failing one by one. Imagine living in a city where things no longer work properly. Waste removal weakens, public maintenance slows, flood damage remains unrepaired. The dead are no longer buried carefully. The routines that once made civilization feel stable begin slipping apart, not overnight. Gradually enough that everybody notices, but nobody fully understands how serious it has become. That's probably closer to the real ending of Mohenjo-Daro. Not one catastrophic afternoon, more like a long exhaustion. And exhaustion can bury empires just as effectively as war. Some of the skeletons showed no signs of violent injury. Archaeology frequently ruins exciting theories. Researchers concluded the remains represented ordinary deaths during the city's declining phases. Disease, perhaps, flooding, malnutrition, environmental stress, or simply people dying in a struggling city that no longer functioned efficiently enough to care for them properly afterward, which feels haunting in a very quiet way. There's a particular loneliness to abandoned urban spaces, especially ancient ones. Imagine walking through Mohenjo-Daro during its later years. Sections of the city already stand empty, some homes abandoned entirely. Walls cracked from age, floods, or seismic activity. Dust gathering in courtyards once swept daily. And still, people remain. A reduced population trying to continue ordinary life inside a place slowly unraveling around them. Some families refused to leave because of ancestors. Others lacked resources. And some genuinely believed recovery would come. Because humans are unbelievably optimistic about unstable situations. Every civilization contains at least one stubborn man standing ankle-deep in disaster, insisting everything is basically under control. Meanwhile, the city is literally sinking into mud behind him. At Mohenjo-Daro, evidence suggests repeated rebuilding. Streets rose higher as flood deposits accumulated beneath new construction. Think about how strange that must have felt psychologically. Imagine your city physically rising over buried ruins of its earlier self. Old streets disappearing underground, new walls built atop ancient debris. Every generation inheriting a slightly more unstable version. And somewhere beneath those streets lay older neighborhoods already forgotten. That layering creates a feeling almost dreamlike. A city slowly burying itself while still alive. Some scholars believe earthquakes intensified these problems. Seismic activity could have damaged wells and altered drainage patterns. Now combine that with climate shifts reducing water reliability in surrounding regions. The result becomes deeply exhausting. Too much water sometimes, not enough water at other times. and the ground itself occasionally trembling without warning. Ancient people could adapt to hardship remarkably well. But adaptation has limits, especially urban civilizations dependent on large-scale coordination. A giant city with infrastructure becomes far more fragile. Cities require confidence. Confidence in water, harvests and transportation. Confidence that tomorrow will resemble today. Once that confidence breaks down, cities start hollowing from within. And perhaps that is exactly what happened across the Harappan world. Not one single collapse. Many small fractures accumulating together. Trade routes weakened too. This part often gets overlooked. But trade mattered enormously to Harappan prosperity. The civilization exchanged goods across vast distances. Carnelian beads, cotton textiles, copper objects, shell ornaments, even connections with Mesopotamia hundreds of miles away. Mesopotamian records describe merchants from Meluha. Imagine those long-distance trade journeys. Boats along rivers, caravans crossing dry landscapes, merchants between cultures. And then imagine those systems weakening. River routes become unreliable, settlements decline, agricultural production suffers. Suddenly trade grows dangerous, expensive, unpredictable. The giant interconnected machine of civilization begins losing pieces. And interconnected systems collapse surprisingly fast once enough pressure builds. The Harappans once specialized in precision. Standardized weights existed. Brick dimensions remained astonishingly consistent. But during the civilization's later phases, some of that standardization appears to weaken. The orderliness fades gradually, like watching a perfectly neat room slowly becoming cluttered because nobody has energy left to maintain it. At smaller settlements, archaeologists found signs of adaptation. People shifted lifestyles. Populations dispersed. Communities continued surviving. Culture transformed instead of simply ending. Civilizations rarely disappear completely. People continue. Languages evolve. Traditions mutate. Stories about powerful rivers, great brick cities, and ancestors who traded with distant lands. And stories about the earth shaking. The ground is supposed to stay still. That is one of reality's basic agreements. When the earth moves, existence feels unreliable. One particularly haunting aspect of Mohenjo-Daro is how ordinary many objects feel. Dice, jewelry, tools, children's toys. Archaeology often feels intimate in unexpected ways. A giant temple impresses you, but a toy makes you remember real people lived there. Someone once laughed in those streets. Someone once complained about heat while carrying water from a well. History becomes human through tiny things. At Harappan sites, archaeologists discovered pottery still marked by fingerprints baked into clay thousands of years ago. Fingerprints. Actual fingerprints. The physical traces of people whose names vanished before most recorded history even began. There's something deeply strange about that. A civilization forgotten entirely, its language unreadable, and yet one potter's fingerprint still survives. As Mohenjo-Daro continued declining, nature slowly reclaimed sections of the city. Flood deposits accumulated, walls eroded, empty homes collapsed inward. Dust drifted through abandoned streets where organized urban life had once flourished. And eventually, silence settled fully. Not dramatic silence, just the ordinary silence of a place no longer inhabited, until even memory itself faded. And for thousands of years afterward, the old city slept quietly beside the river that may have betrayed it. And so, slowly, almost politely, the Harappan world faded from history. Not with fire, not with conquering armies charging dramatically through gates, not with one final emperor screaming curses at the sky while everything collapsed around him in cinematic slow motion, History almost never behaves that neatly. Instead, the Harappans slipped away the way rivers change course, quietly at first, then completely. By around 1900 BCE, many of the great urban centers had weakened significantly. Mohenjo-daro declined, Harappa shrank. Other settlements fragmented into smaller communities spread across wider regions. Urban life, once astonishingly organized, gradually loosened into something more local and rural. And perhaps that transition felt less like the end of civilization and more like exhaustion. Because civilizations do not always die dramatically. Sometimes people simply stop believing the old systems still work. Imagine the final generations living there. The old stories still circulate. Grandparents remembering when the markets overflowed with traders from distant lands, when the river arrived predictably, when workshops stayed busy, when the city felt permanent. But younger generations inherit something different. Fewer people, more abandoned buildings, less certainty. And somewhere in the background, nature continues behaving strangely. The floods arrive wrong, or not at all. The wells produce less water. The earth trembles occasionally beneath sleeping homes. The old confidence disappears, and confidence once lost is very difficult to rebuild, especially in ancient cities already balancing carefully between flood and drought. Some scholars still debate exactly how important earthquakes were in this collapse, and honestly, they probably always will. That's part of the Harappan mystery. The civilization refuses to give us a clean answer. No readable historical records survive explaining what happened. No king carved a dramatic inscription saying, "Terrible earthquakes destroyed our lands. Please remember us." Instead, we get fragments, cracked walls, shifted foundations, dry riverbeds, flood deposits, abandoned neighborhoods. And from those fragments, modern researchers try to reconstruct the emotional experience of an entire civilization slowly coming apart. Geologists study tectonic movement beneath the Indus region. Archaeologists examine layers of destruction and rebuilding. Climate scientists analyze ancient monsoon patterns, everyone assembling pieces of a puzzle that may never fully fit together. But perhaps that uncertainty feels strangely appropriate. Because real life rarely provides perfect explanations. Civilizations collapse through combinations of pressures: environmental change, economic stress, migration, political weakening, natural disasters, human stubbornness, and occasionally simple bad luck stretched across generations. The Harappans may have faced all of those things together, which honestly sounds exhausting. And yet, even after the cities faded, the people themselves did not vanish completely. That part matters deeply. Too often, ancient civilizations get described as if entire populations magically disappeared into thin air. But people survive. They adapt. They move. Harappan traditions likely flowed into later cultures across South Asia in ways historians still debate today. Farming practices continued. Craft traditions survived. Communities evolved. Human life carried onward, because humans are remarkably persistent creatures, even after systems collapse, even after cities empty, even after rivers betray them. Life continues somewhere else. Still, there remains something haunting about those abandoned brick cities beneath the dust, especially because for thousands of years, nobody remembered them properly. Imagine that silence. The once crowded streets of Mohenjo-daro buried beneath earth and heat. The great bath slowly filling with debris. The drains clogging permanently at last. Homes collapsing inward season by season until they became little more than uneven mounds beneath the sun. And above them, entirely new civilizations rose and fell. Empires appeared. Kingdoms fought wars. Religions spread. Languages changed. Meanwhile, the Harappan cities waited underground in silence. There's something almost peaceful about that image. a lost civilization sleeping beneath history itself. Then eventually, in the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists began uncovering them again, and suddenly humanity remembered. The rediscovery of the Harappans changed how we understood ancient history entirely, because before those excavations, many people assumed early urban civilization belonged mainly to Mesopotamia and Egypt. But beneath the soil of South Asia rested another enormous civilization, just as sophisticated in many ways. Planned cities, trade networks, standardized engineering, complex craftsmanship, and of course, the legendary drains. Never forget the drains. Honestly, if ancient civilizations had award ceremonies, the Harappans would quietly win Most Responsible Urban Planning, while every empire ruled by unstable warrior kings glared. Yet the mystery remains incomplete. Their writing system still cannot be fully read. Their rulers remain uncertain, their religion only partially understood, and their collapse continues provoking debate. Did earthquakes trigger devastating river shifts? Did climate change weaken agriculture beyond recovery? Did trade failures slowly hollow out the cities? Or was it everything together, arriving generation after generation, until urban life simply became impossible to sustain? Most likely, yes. All of it. Civilizations are complicated organisms, and complicated organisms rarely fail for only one reason. As we reach the end of tonight's journey, picture the final quiet years of one Harappan neighborhood. An old brick house standing beside a narrow street, a family eating together in fading evening light, dust moving softly through warm air. Outside, fewer voices echo now. Some nearby homes already stand abandoned. The river no longer behaves the way it once did. And maybe, late at night, someone feels the faint trembling of the earth beneath the floor. Not violent, just enough to notice, enough to wonder, enough to feel uncertainty settling slowly into daily life. Then imagine generations passing. The family leaves eventually. Others leave too. The streets empty. Wind moves through broken walls. Floodwater lays down another layer of silt. The city sinks quietly into the landscape. And over thousands of years, the world forgets it entirely. Until one day archaeologists arrive with brushes and notebooks, uncovering fingerprints in clay and carefully measuring ancient drains, while trying desperately to hear echoes from a civilization that no longer speaks. And maybe that is the true Harappan secret. Not whether earthquakes buried the empire overnight, but how fragile even the most organized human worlds really are. A river shifts, the climate changes, the ground trembles beneath your feet, and suddenly a civilization that once felt eternal becomes dust beneath history, quietly, slowly, almost without anyone noticing the exact moment it disappeared. So tonight, as you settle deeper into sleep, somewhere beneath modern towns and dry riverbeds, the old Harappan cities are still there, still waiting under the earth, their streets silent, their wells empty, their drains resting at last after 4,000 years, and beneath them all, the ground still moves quietly in the dark. Let's begin in a place that smells faintly of damp stone, old straw, and the kind of silence that feels a little too intentional. We are somewhere in medieval Europe. The exact year does not matter much, because honestly, for a few hundred years, not much changed for people who were declared mad. If anything, the definitions just got more creative. Now, the word mad was doing a lot of work back then. It could mean someone heard voices, or someone refused to follow social rules, or someone cried too much, or laughed at the wrong time, or just didn't fit neatly into whatever box society preferred that week. And naturally, the solution people came up with was not therapy, or kindness, or even basic curiosity. No. The solution was, put them somewhere else, preferably somewhere with thick walls. At first, there were no proper institutions. No grand asylums with official names. Just small rooms, back areas of monasteries, cells in hospitals that were not really hospitals, more like holding zones for inconvenient humans. If a family had enough money, they might quietly keep a relative hidden away at home, a locked room, a servant assigned to bring food, conversations kept to a minimum because acknowledging the situation would make it real. If they didn't have money, then the person might be handed over to a religious house. Monasteries were, in theory, places of care. In practice, it depended heavily on who was running the place and how patient they felt that year. Sometimes the treatment was prayer. Lots of it, hours and hours, because if someone was behaving strangely, the obvious explanation at the time was that something supernatural was involved. Demons were very popular. It was rarely, maybe this person is suffering. It was more like, something is wrong with them, and we need to get it out. And when people say get it out, they did not mean gently. Exorcisms were a thing, a very committed thing. Imagine being already distressed, confused, maybe frightened, and then surrounded by people chanting loudly, insisting that something evil is inside you, which, if you were not already having a bad time, would certainly help you get there. Of course, not everyone believed in demons as the cause. Some thought madness came from imbalances in the body. The famous four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, a kind of ancient internal soup theory. If your humours were off, your mind would be too. So the solution? Bleeding, purging, more bleeding. Because if something is wrong inside the body, clearly the answer is to remove as much of it as possible. Very logical, very confident, not very effective. Now, let's gently drift toward one of the earliest and most famous places associated with madness, Bethlehem Hospital in London. Or, as it later became known, Bedlam. Yes, that Bedlam. The word you now use for chaos and noise and everything being completely out of control. Originally founded in the 13th century, it was not designed exclusively for the mentally ill. It was more of a general hospital, but over time it slowly became specialized. And by specialized, I mean it became a place where people labeled as mad were sent and largely forgotten. Conditions were, to put it mildly, not great. Patients were often chained, sometimes to walls, sometimes to their beds, because movement was considered dangerous. Freedom was considered risky. And also, chains are cheaper than understanding human behavior. What makes Bedlam especially unique is that at certain points in history, it became a kind of public attraction. Yes, a tourist spot. For a small fee, ordinary people could come in and look at the patients, watch them, laugh at them, treat them as entertainment. Because if someone is suffering in a way you don't understand, one coping mechanism is empathy, and another, apparently, is buying a ticket and turning it into a day out. Visitors would walk through the halls, observing people who were distressed, confused, sometimes shouting, sometimes silent. It was described as educational, which is a very polite word for what was essentially human exhibition. Now, not every person inside Bedlam was severely mentally ill. Some were just inconvenient. A woman who argued too much. A man who refused to follow orders. Someone who embarrassed their family. Someone who threatened inheritance lines. Because once the label mad was applied, it was surprisingly flexible and very hard to remove. Let's imagine, for a moment, a well-connected family, wealthy, concerned with reputation. One of their members starts behaving in ways that attract attention. Maybe they speak out of turn. Maybe they question authority. Maybe they fall into deep sadness and stop participating in society. This becomes a problem. So the family arranges for them to be placed somewhere discreet. A doctor signs a paper. A relative nods solemnly. And just like that, a person disappears from public life. Not dead. Not officially exiled, just relocated. Out of sight. Out of mind. And once inside these early institutions, leaving was not simple, because to leave, you had to prove you were sane. And the people deciding that were often the same ones who put you there in the first place. Which is a bit like asking the lock if it believes the key deserves to exist. Now, let's float slightly to another figure, someone whose story sits right on the edge between legend and documented history. King Charles VI of France, also known as Charles the Mad. Of course he was. Born in 1368, Charles started his reign with promise. He was young, energetic, and for a while, things seemed relatively stable, which, in medieval monarchy terms, is already quite impressive. But in his early 20s, something began to shift. He started experiencing episodes. At times, he would become convinced that he was made of glass. Yes, glass. This condition, sometimes called glass delusion, appeared in several historical figures. The fear was that any sudden movement, any contact, might shatter them, so Charles would avoid being touched. He wore reinforced clothing to protect himself. He moved carefully, anxiously, as if his body were something fragile and at constant risk. And honestly, when you think about the pressures of being a medieval king, constant political tension, wars, expectations, betrayal, it almost feels like his mind chose the most literal metaphor possible. I am under pressure and I might break. Just taken very literally. At other times, Charles would not recognize people around him, even close family, even his own wife. He had violent outbursts as well. In one infamous incident, he attacked members of his own entourage during a sudden episode, killing several of them, which, as you can imagine, made the court slightly uneasy. Because when your king might suddenly forget who you are and decide you are a threat, workplace morale tends to drop. Between episodes, Charles could appear relatively normal, calm, even charming, which made everything more confusing. Was he fit to rule? Was he not? Who decides? In practice, power shifted around him. Advisors, relatives, rival factions, all stepping in, each claiming to act in the kingdom's best interest. Because when a ruler is declared mad, it creates a vacuum, and people love vacuums. Politically speaking, Charles was not locked in a dungeon or displayed like Bedlam patients. He was still a king. Titles protect you, to a point, but he was managed, controlled, sometimes isolated. His condition became both a personal tragedy and a political tool, and that pattern will repeat itself again and again, because madness in history is rarely just about the individual. It's about what happens around them, who benefits, who decides, who gets to define reality, and who gets quietly removed from it. Now, as we slowly drift forward in time, the spaces for the mad become more formalized, more structured, more official, which sounds like progress, and in some ways it was. But also, not always, because once society builds a system for something, it tends to use it extensively and not always carefully. So next, we'll ease into a world where asylums grow larger, diagnoses grow more confident, and the line between illness and inconvenience becomes even blurrier. Because why keep things simple when you can build an entire institution around misunderstanding? And trust me, they did. So now we gently drift into a time when people decided that what madness really needed was organization. Because if there is one thing humans love, it is taking something confusing and building a system around it, preferably with paperwork. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe began to see the rise of institutions that were more clearly designed for people considered mentally unwell, or socially inconvenient, or just difficult. These places were often called asylums, which sounds comforting, a place of refuge, a safe space, and in theory that was the idea. In practice, it depended very heavily on who was in charge, how much money was involved, and how patient the staff felt that particular decade. Now, something interesting started happening around this time. Society became more concerned with order, with categorizing things, classifying them, putting them neatly into boxes. Plants were classified, animals were classified, and naturally, people were classified too, including the mad. So instead of just saying, "This person behaves strangely," there was now an effort to define types of madness. Melancholia, mania, hysteria, each with its own supposed symptoms, causes, and, most importantly, treatments, because once you name something, you feel like you understand it, even if you don't. Let's take melancholia. For example, this was often associated with deep sadness, withdrawal, a kind of quiet despair. Today, we might recognize elements of depression in it. Back then, it was often linked to an excess of black bile, that old favorite from the humors theory. So the treatment? You guessed it, bleeding, diet changes, sometimes strange herbal mixtures that probably tasted like regret. And then there was hysteria. Diagnosis that was applied almost exclusively to women. Of course it was. The idea was that women were naturally more emotional, more unstable, more prone to irrational behavior, which, conveniently, made it easier to label any woman who didn't conform as hysterical. Too outspoken. Hysterical. Too sad. Hysterical. Too independent. Extremely hysterical. There was even a belief that hysteria was caused by a wandering womb. Yes, the womb apparently could just move around the body, causing chaos as it went, which is a very creative explanation for human emotion. Treatments for hysteria ranged from the mildly strange to the deeply uncomfortable. Some involved rest cures, isolation, being told to lie still and not think too much. Others involved physical interventions that were intrusive. All of them shared one common feature. They were based on the assumption that the woman was the problem, not her environment, not her circumstances, just her. Now, let's step inside one of these growing asylums. Imagine a large building, stone walls, high windows, long corridors that echo slightly when you walk. There is a sense of control, of routine. Patients wake at certain times, eat at certain times, sleep at certain times. Everything is scheduled because the belief was that structure could restore order to a disordered mind. And again, that sounds reasonable until you look a little closer. Restraints were still common. Chains, straps, confinement chairs, devices designed to limit movement, to enforce stillness. Because agitation was seen as something to suppress, not understand. There was also something called the tranquilizing chair, which sounds very peaceful. It was not. It was essentially a chair where a person would be strapped in, unable to move, sometimes for hours. The idea was that by restricting the body, you could calm the mind, which is a bit like saying, if we freeze the storm, maybe it will stop being a storm. There were also spinning chairs. Yes, spinning. Patients would be strapped into a chair and spun rapidly. The belief was that this could somehow reset the brain, or at least make the person too dizzy to continue. Whatever behavior was bothering everyone else, which technically might work for a few minutes. But it doesn't exactly address the underlying issue. Now, not every asylum was cruel in the same way. There were reformers, people who looked at these conditions and thought, this seems unnecessarily harsh. One of the more well-known figures is Philippe Pinel in France. In the late 18th century, Pinel became famous for removing chains from patients in asylums. A simple act, but a powerful one. He believed that people with mental illness should be treated with compassion, that they were still human beings deserving of dignity, which at the time was a surprisingly radical idea. Because the baseline had been set quite low, Pinel introduced what was called moral treatment. This didn't mean morale in the sense of judging behavior. It meant psychological, emotional. Patients were encouraged to engage in conversation, to spend time outdoors, to have some level of social interaction. There was an attempt to understand rather than just control. And for a while, this approach showed promise. Similar ideas spread to England, with figures like William Tuke, who established more humane institutions. Places where patients were not immediately chained, where the environment was calmer, where routines were meant to support rather than suppress. But here's the quiet twist. As these more humane methods became popular, asylums also began to grow, larger, more numerous. Because now there was a belief that these institutions could actually help people, which encouraged more families, more authorities to send individuals there, and slowly the numbers increased. What started as a reform movement began to feed into a system. More patients meant more pressure. More pressure meant less time per person. Less time meant a return to control methods, because when you have too many people and not enough staff, understanding becomes inefficient, and efficiency often wins. So even as ideas improved, conditions in many places began to slide back. Overcrowding became a serious problem. Rooms meant for a few people held many. Resources stretched thin. Staff overwhelmed. And in that environment, the line between care and containment blurred again. Now, let's gently shift toward a different kind of story. Not an institution this time, but a person, a woman named Margaret Nicholson. In 1786, she attempted to assassinate King George III of Britain. She approached him with a knife. It was not a particularly sophisticated attempt. She was quickly restrained, and when questioned, it became clear that she was not part of a political conspiracy. She believed quite firmly that she had a legitimate claim against the king, that her actions made sense. In other words, she was considered mad. Now, this created a dilemma. Attempting to kill the king is usually treated very seriously. But executing someone who is clearly not in control of their actions, that felt complicated. So instead of a typical punishment, Margaret Nicholson was declared insane and sent to an asylum. Specifically, Bethlehem. Yes, we're back there again, because once you are labeled mad, the legal system often takes a different path. You are no longer a criminal in the usual sense. You are something else, someone to be contained. Margaret Nicholson spent the rest of her life in Bethlehem. Decades. Removed from society, not as a prisoner exactly, but not free either. A kind of in-between state, and this becomes another pattern, madness, as a legal category. A way to explain behavior that doesn't fit. A way to avoid certain punishments, but also a way to justify indefinite confinement. Because if someone is mad, when are they considered safe again? Who decides? And what if they never decide? So as we continue drifting forward, the systems become more complex. Medicine starts to take a more central role. Doctors gain more authority. Diagnoses become more detailed. And with that, comes a new kind of confidence, the belief that madness can be understood, measured, treated, possibly even cured, which sounds hopeful, but also opens the door to something else. Because when people believe they understand the mind, they tend to experiment on it, gently at first, then less gently. And that is where we're heading next. Into a world of early psychiatry, ambitious theories, and treatments that were creative, in the way that makes you slowly raise an eyebrow and say, maybe not. So just settle in, let the walls of the old asylum fade a little, and we'll move forward. Into an era where science steps in, and immediately starts making some very confident guesses. So now we drift into the 19th and early 20th centuries, where everything starts to feel a bit more official. Whitecoats appear, medical terminology expands, and people begin speaking about the mind with the same confidence they use for bones, lungs, and infections, which is impressive, and also slightly concerning, because unlike a broken arm, the human mind does not come with clear instructions. But that did not stop anyone. In fact, it had the opposite effect. Doctors, now calling themselves psychiatrists, began developing theories, detailed ones, with diagrams, classifications, and very serious-looking notes. Madness was no longer just spiritual or moral, it was medical, which sounds like progress, and in some ways, it absolutely was. There was less talk of demons, less reliance on purely religious explanations, but something else quietly took its place. Control through science. Because if something is a medical condition, then it can be treated, and if it can be treated, it can also be managed, and if it can be managed, well, now we're back to systems again. Let's start with one of the more famous approaches, the rest cure, developed by Silas Weir Mitchell in the late 1800s. This treatment was often prescribed to women diagnosed with hysteria, anxiety, or depression. And the idea was simple: do absolutely nothing. Patients were confined to bed for weeks, sometimes months. No reading, no writing, no social interaction beyond limited contact with a caretaker. They were fed rich foods, milk, meat, heavy meals. The goal was to restore physical strength, which was believed to also restore mental balance. Now, imagine being someone who is already feeling trapped, overwhelmed, or emotionally distressed, and then being told, your treatment is to lie still and not think. For some, it may have offered a strange kind of quiet. For many others, it made things worse. There's a famous example of this in literature. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who underwent the rest cure and later wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, a story that feels calm on the surface and deeply unsettling underneath. Because when the mind has nowhere to go, it doesn't just stop, it turns inward. Now let's gently shift to something even more hands-on, early physical treatments, because at this point, doctors were not just observing behavior, they wanted to intervene directly. One such method was insulin coma therapy. Yes, patients were injected with large doses of insulin, which would induce a coma. The belief was that this could somehow reset the brain, a kind of neurological reboot. Sometimes patients were brought out of the coma successfully, sometimes not. It was risky, unpredictable, but it was used widely because, again, the confidence was there, the understanding less so. Then came electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. Now, this one is a bit complicated because, unlike some other treatments, ECT is still used today in controlled and carefully monitored ways. But in its early days, it was rough. Patients were given electric shocks to induce seizures. No anesthesia at first. No muscle relaxants. Just the raw procedure. The idea was that seizures could somehow interrupt patterns of mental illness, and strangely enough, in some cases it did seem to help, which made it stick around. But the experience itself was intense, and not exactly comforting. Now, we arrive at one of the most well-known and quietly disturbing chapters in this story, the lobotomy. Developed in the 1930s, popularized in the 1940s, the procedure involved severing connections in the brain's frontal lobes. Because those areas were associated with personality, emotion, decision-making, and the thinking was, if those parts are causing problems, maybe we can just adjust them, or, more bluntly, reduce them. One of the most famous figures associated with lobotomy was Walter Freeman, an American neurologist who took the procedure and made it accessible, which is one way to describe it. He developed a method called the transorbital lobotomy, often referred to as the ice pick lobotomy, because the instrument used looked very much like one. It was inserted through the eye socket, tapped gently with a hammer, and moved to sever brain connections, a procedure that could be done in minutes. No need for a full surgical theater. Efficiency. Once again, Freeman traveled around the United States, performing thousands of these procedures, sometimes in hospitals, sometimes in less formal settings. He became something of a showman, which is not exactly what you want in brain surgery. Now, did lobotomies work? That depends on how you define work. Patients often became calmer, less agitated, less expressive, which made them easier to manage. But they also lost parts of themselves. Emotions flattened, personalities changed. Some became passive, childlike. Others were left unable to function independently. So yes, the visible symptoms were reduced, but at a cost that is difficult to ignore. One of the most well-known cases is Rosemary Kennedy, sister of John F. Kennedy. She was described as having mood swings, behavioral difficulties. In 1941, at the age of 23, she underwent a lobotomy. The result was devastating. She lost much of her ability to speak, to care for herself, and she spent the rest of her life in institutional care, quietly, largely hidden from public view, because even in prominent families, the pattern remained. If someone did not fit, they were removed. Now, by the mid-20th century, something began to shift again, gradually, not all at once, but enough to notice. Psychiatry started to question itself, which is always an interesting moment, because for decades, treatments had been applied with confidence. Now, there was growing awareness that some of those treatments had caused harm, serious harm. At the same time, new medications were being developed, antipsychotics, antidepressants, drugs that could alter brain chemistry in more controlled ways, not perfectly, but with less ice-pick involvement. This led to a process called deinstitutionalization. Large asylums began to close or reduce their populations. The idea was to move people back into communities, to provide outpatient care. Support systems, a life outside of walls, which sounds like a hopeful turn, and in many ways it was, but it was also incomplete, because while institutions were closing, community support systems were not always fully built. So some people found themselves in a new kind of uncertainty, no longer confined, but not fully supported either, and the label of madness did not disappear, it just changed shape. Today, we use different words: mental illness, psychological disorders, neurodivergence. The language is more precise, more respectful, most of the time, but the underlying questions remain. Who decides what is normal? Who defines the boundary between eccentric and unwell? At what point does society step in? And on what terms? Because if history shows us anything, it's that these definitions are not fixed. They shift, they bend, they reflect the values, fears and limitations of their time. And sometimes they say more about society than about the individual being labelled. So when we look back at those quiet rooms, those stone walls, those long corridors filled with misunderstood people, it's easy to feel a sense of distance, to think that was then. But traces of it still exist, in subtler forms, in the way we react to behavior we don't understand, in the way discomfort turns into labels, in the quiet decisions about who fits and who doesn't. And so the story doesn't really end, it just softens, fades a little, like footsteps down a long hallway, somewhere between care and control, understanding and assumption, silence and voice. And if you listen closely, it's still there, just much quieter now. Let's begin in ancient Babylon, because of course we are. It's around 1750 BCE, and King Hammurabi has decided that what society really needs is structure, clear rules, firm consequences. A nice, tidy list carved into stone so nobody can say, "Oh, I didn't know." And to be fair, it's one of the earliest legal codes we have. It is also incredibly intense. Now, Hammurabi's laws are often remembered for the whole eye for an eye concept, which sounds simple enough, balanced, almost poetic, until you look at how specific things get. For example, if a builder constructs a house and it collapses, killing the owner, the builder is put to death, which is already quite a strong performance review. But then it continues. If the collapse kills the owner's son, then the builder's son is put to death, not the builder. The son, because apparently responsibility could be redistributed. And you can almost imagine the builder standing there thinking, "Okay, so I really need to double-check those walls." It's a legal system that does not gently encourage quality control. It enforces it with generational consequences. There were also laws about daily life that feel oddly personal. If a man accuses his wife of infidelity but has no proof, she must jump into the river. Yes, if she survives, she's innocent. If she doesn't, well, the river has spoken, which is a very dramatic way to handle relationship disputes. Now, let's slowly drift over to ancient Rome, where things become a little more organized, and somehow still just as strange. Rome loved rules. It loved structure. It loved telling people exactly what they could and could not do. And one area they were particularly invested in was clothing. Because clothing is not just clothing, it is status, it is identity. It is a walking announcement of where you stand in society. So naturally, there were laws about it. Sumptuary laws. These laws controlled what people could wear, eat or display depending on their social class. For example, certain colors were restricted. Purple, especially. Tyrian purple was expensive and difficult to produce, so it became associated with the elite. Eventually, it was basically reserved for emperors. So if you woke up one morning in ancient Rome and thought, "You know what, I feel like wearing a nice purple robe today," the law would gently respond, "No, you don't," because that color was not for you. It was for someone who ruled an empire and probably had a very complicated family situation. And Rome did not stop at colors. There were also rules about how much you could spend on feasts, because nothing says we care about social stability like regulating dinner parties. If you threw a feast that was too lavish, too extravagant, it could be seen as excessive and possibly illegal. Imagine inviting friends over and thinking, "Okay, I need to make this impressive, but not legally concerning." A delicate balance. Now, let's float gently into medieval Europe, where laws become a mix of practical, symbolic, and occasionally just a bit confusing. In England, for instance, there were laws about archery. Every man was required to practice with a longbow regularly because the kingdom needed skilled archers for war. So Sunday, which you might think is a day for rest, becomes more like, yes, after church, please go outside and practice hitting targets with a weapon. And if you didn't, you could be fined, because nothing builds a strong nation like mandatory hobbies. Now, here's where things get a little more oddly specific. There were laws about beards. In some periods, facial hair was taxed. Yes, if you wanted to have a beard, you might have to pay for the privilege, because apparently even your face was subject to economic policy. Russia, under Peter the Great, is a famous example. He wanted to modernize the country, make it more like Western Europe, and in his mind that meant fewer beards. So he introduced a beard tax. Men who insisted on keeping their beards had to pay and carry a token proving they had done so. Imagine showing someone a small coin and saying, "This allows me to continue having a beard." It's a very specific kind of identity card, and you can almost hear Peter the Great thinking, this will definitely solve everything. Now, let's gently slide into a slightly different category. Laws that tried to control behavior in ways that feel oddly optimistic. In medieval and early modern Europe, there were laws against things like excessive complaining or gossip, which, if you think about it, is a bold move. Because trying to legally regulate gossip is like trying to regulate the weather. Ambitious. For example, in some towns, people accused of being common scolds, usually women who spoke loudly or argued frequently, could be punished, sometimes with something called a scold's bridle, a device placed over the head, with a piece that went into the mouth to prevent speech, which is a very direct way of saying, "We would like you to be quieter." And again, these laws were not evenly applied. They often targeted those with less power, because, as always, enforcement tends to follow convenience. Now, let's float across the ocean to colonial America, where laws continue to be creative. In some places there were laws about how you could celebrate. For example, Christmas was at one point banned in Puritan Massachusetts. Yes, banned, because it was seen as too festive, too indulgent, too joyful, and the authorities were aiming for something a bit more restrained, so celebrating Christmas could get you fined, which gives the holiday a slightly different tone. Happy holidays, but quietly, please. There were also laws about personal appearance. In some colonies, people were fined for wearing clothing that was considered too fancy for their social rank, because heaven forbid someone looks slightly more stylish than their station allows. Now, let's gently drift forward into more modern times, where you might expect laws to become more reasonable. And in many ways they did. But also, not entirely, because once a law exists, it tends to linger, even when it stops making sense. For example, in parts of the United Kingdom, there were laws requiring people to practice archery that technically remained on the books for centuries, long after bows had stopped being the main military technology. So somewhere, theoretically, you could be in violation of a law about not practicing a skill that no one expects you to have anymore, which feels a bit like being legally obligated to learn something you will never use. Then there are local laws, very local, the kind that make you pause and think, something must have happened for this to exist. In parts of the United States, for example, there have been laws about where and how you can carry ice cream, or prohibiting certain animals from doing very specific things, like donkeys sleeping in bathtubs, which sounds absurd, until you realize that at some point, A donkey probably did sleep in a bathtub, and it caused enough inconvenience that someone said, "We need legislation," because nothing becomes a law without a story behind it. And those stories are often quietly chaotic. Now, as we move through all of these examples, there's a gentle pattern that starts to appear. Laws are not just about justice. They are about control, about identity, about trying to shape society into something predictable, even when humans are not predictable at all. And sometimes, in that effort, things get a little strange, a little too specific, a little disconnected from reality, but also very human. Because every odd law is, in its own way, a snapshot, a moment where someone looked at the world and said, This is the problem we need to solve. Even if, from where we're sitting now, it feels like the problem was something else entirely. So let's slowly move on, away from beards and bathtubs, toward even more peculiar attempts to regulate daily life. Because if you thought those were specific, just wait until we get into laws about food, fashion, and the deeply serious issue of how many buttons you are allowed to have. Yes, that is, unfortunately, a real direction this is going. So now we gently glide into a world where lawmakers looked at society and thought, you know what this needs? Fewer buttons. Because yes, we are now entering the era of laws that regulate fashion down to the smallest, most unnecessary detail. Let's settle into early modern Europe again, where sumptuary laws are still very much alive and doing far too much. These laws were not just about colors anymore. They expanded into fabrics, decorations, accessories, and for some reason, buttons. In certain regions, there were rules about how many buttons a person could have on their clothing, depending on their social rank, because clearly, nothing threatens social order more than an ambitious number of buttons. If you were a commoner and decided to wear a doublet with an impressive row of decorative buttons, the law might step in and say, that's a bit too aspirational. The idea was to make sure that people looked like their status. No confusion. No accidental elegance. You could not simply dress like a noble and hope for the best. Society needed visual clarity, and apparently, buttons were a key part of that system. Now, let's imagine someone carefully counting their outfit before leaving the house. 1, 2, 3. Okay, this is legally acceptable. It's a very calm but slightly stressful way to get dressed. And of course, people tried to get around these rules. They always do. If buttons were restricted, maybe you add embroidery instead. If certain fabrics were banned, maybe you find something that looks very similar. Because fashion, like water, tends to find a way, which means lawmakers had to keep updating the rules, adding more details, more restrictions, more very specific opinions about sleeves. And yes, sleeves were also a problem. In some places, the size and style of sleeves were regulated. Too large? Too decorative? That might suggest wealth you do not officially have, and we cannot have sleeves creating social confusion. Now, let's slowly drift from clothing to food. Because if you thought people were particular about fashion, wait until you see how they handled eating. In various parts of Europe, there were laws about what people could eat, how often and in what quantity, again, tied to class. Because your diet was supposed to reflect your position in society. Certain meats, spices, and dishes were reserved for the wealthy. If you were lower class and somehow managed to acquire these foods, you might technically be breaking the law just by enjoying your meal, which adds a slightly tense atmosphere to dinner. This tastes amazing, and possibly illegal. Feasts, especially, were heavily regulated. Authorities worried about excess, about people showing off, about social boundaries becoming blurry over a very enthusiastic meal. So they created rules limiting the number of courses, the types of ingredients, even the occasions on which certain foods could be served, because nothing says we trust you like controlling your dinner menu. Now let's float over to Italy, where these laws became particularly detailed. In Renaissance cities like Florence, there were entire offices dedicated to monitoring luxury. Officials would observe weddings, banquets, clothing. They kept records. They issued fines. They paid attention, very close attention. Imagine hosting a wedding and knowing that someone in the crowd is quietly counting how many dishes are being served. Not as a guesstimate, but as a representative of the law, just gently observing your pasta choices. Now, weddings themselves were also subject to rules, because they were, of course, prime opportunities for showing off wealth. So, laws limited how extravagant they could be, how many guests, how much decoration, what the bride could wear, which must have been slightly disappointing for anyone who had been planning their dream wedding and then discovered it needed to be legally toned down. Sorry, we had to remove 3 layers of elegance. It was becoming unlawful. Now let's shift slightly into laws that tried to control behavior in public spaces. Because once you step outside, apparently everything becomes a potential legal issue. In some places, there were rules about how people could walk. Not the act of walking itself, but the manner. Loitering, for example, became something authorities wanted to manage. Standing around without a clear purpose could be seen as suspicious, so laws were introduced to discourage it, which means that simply existing in a public space without a visible task could become questionable. You had to look like you were going somewhere, even if you weren't. A very early version of walk with confidence and no one will question you. Now, here's another quiet favorite: laws about noise. Because cities were growing, people were living closer together, and suddenly, sound became a problem. So there were rules about when you could make noise, what kind of noise, how loud. In some areas, certain activities were restricted at night, which makes sense, but then it gets more specific. There were regulations about street vendors shouting, about musicians playing, about people generally being too audible, because apparently, even in the past, someone was trying to sleep, and someone else was making that difficult. And the law stepped in like a slightly tired neighbor. Now, let's gently drift into something even more oddly particular: animal laws. Because animals, as it turns out, do not always behave in ways that align with human expectations. And when that happens, the natural response is legislation. In medieval Europe, animals could actually be put on trial. Yes, trial, with a form of legal process. If a pig caused harm, for example, it might be arrested, tried, and punished, which creates a very surreal image. A courtroom, a judge, and a pig that is, presumably, not fully aware of the legal proceedings. There are records of animals being assigned legal representation, which is both fascinating and deeply strange. Because on one hand, it suggests a commitment to process. On the other, it raises some questions about practicality. Now, as we move forward in time, animal laws become less theatrical, but still quite specific. In various places, there were rules about where animals could go, what they could do, and how they should behave, which, again, suggests a level of optimism, because controlling human behavior is already difficult. Controlling animals adds a whole new layer. And yet, the laws persisted, because when something causes enough inconvenience, someone eventually writes it down. Now, let's slowly slide into another category. Laws that feel like they were written after a very particular incident. The kind where you can almost see the moment that inspired them. For example, laws about carrying certain objects in specific ways, or restrictions on unusual activities that seem too specific to be random. These are the laws that make you pause and think. Something definitely happened, and someone, somewhere decided, we are not dealing with that again. So they wrote it into law, a permanent reminder of a temporary problem. And over time, many of these laws stayed, even when the original situation faded away. Because laws, once created, are surprisingly good at lingering. They settle in. They become part of the background, quietly existing, sometimes enforced, sometimes forgotten, but always there, like a very patient note from the past. Now, as we continue drifting, something becomes clear. These laws are not just about control. They are about anxiety, about uncertainty, about trying to manage a world that feels unpredictable. So you regulate clothing, you regulate food, you regulate behavior, you regulate noise, you even regulate buttons, because each rule is an attempt to make things stable, understandable, contained, even if the result is a system that feels, from a distance, a little overcommitted. So let's gently move on, again, away from sleeves and soup, toward laws that tried to regulate something even more complicated, human relationships. Because if you thought buttons were difficult to control, just wait until we get into love, marriage, and the deeply ambitious idea that feelings could be legislated, which, as you might expect, goes very smoothly. So now we slowly drift into one of humanity's favorite complicated topics, relationships. Because if there is anything that has consistently resisted order, structure, and neat classification, it is how people feel about each other. And naturally, that did not stop lawmakers from trying. Not gently, not cautiously, but with full confidence. Let's begin with marriage, because that is where most of these laws tend to gather. Across many societies, marriage was not just a personal decision, it was a social contract, an economic arrangement, a political tool, and occasionally, something people actually wanted. But mostly, it was about structure. So laws were introduced to control who could marry whom, which sounds predictable, until you see how detailed it becomes. In medieval and early modern Europe, marriages often required approval. From families, from authorities, from the church, because love left unsupervised was considered unreliable. So if two people wanted to marry, it was not enough that they agreed. Other people had to agree as well, preferably people with status and strong opinions. Now, if you tried to bypass this system, things could get complicated. Secret marriages or clandestine marriages did happen. People would find a priest, say their vows, and consider it done, which was technically valid in some periods, but also highly frowned upon, because it removed control from families and institutions. And control, as we've seen, is something laws tend to protect. So eventually, stricter regulations came in, formal ceremonies, official records, witnesses, because nothing says romance like paperwork. Now, let's gently move into something even more specific. Who you could not marry, because this list was extensive. There were laws against marrying close relatives, which, to be fair, is one of the more reasonable categories. but then it expanded. In some places, you could not marry your deceased spouses, sibling, or certain distant relations, or anyone connected to you through complicated lines of kinship that required a diagram to fully understand. The Church kept track of these relationships with impressive dedication because preventing the wrong kind of marriage was seen as essential. And yet, interestingly, exceptions could be made with enough influence or enough money. So while the rules were strict, they were also occasionally flexible, which is a pattern we've seen before. Now, let's float toward laws about how marriages should function. Because it was not enough to regulate who could marry, there were also expectations about behavior within marriage. For example, in some societies there were laws about obedience. Specifically, the expectation that wives should obey their husbands. And if that did not happen, there were legal consequences, sometimes subtle, sometimes less so. There were even discussions in certain legal traditions about the acceptable limits of discipline, which is a very calm way of describing something that was, in reality, quite serious. And again, these laws reflect the structure of the society: hierarchy, authority, control, all quietly embedded in personal relationships. Now, let's take a softer turn, or at least something that sounds softer: laws about affection, because in some places, public displays of affection were regulated. Kissing, holding hands, general expressions of fondness, all subject to social and sometimes legal boundaries, because emotions, when visible, could be seen as disruptive, or inappropriate, or simply too much. So there were rules about where affection could happen, when, and how much, which turns something natural into something carefully measured. Now, let's drift into something slightly more unexpected. Laws about heartbreak. Not directly, of course. No one wrote a law saying, "You may only feel this sad." But there were laws about promises, especially promises of marriage. If someone promised to marry another person and then broke that promise, there could be legal consequences. In some cases, the injured party could sue for damages, because a broken promise was not just emotional, it could affect reputation, social standing, future prospects. So the law stepped in and said, "This matters," which is, in a quiet way, surprisingly empathetic, even if the solution was financial compensation. Now, let's gently move towards something that feels both familiar and slightly strange. Laws about loneliness. Or rather, laws about being alone in certain ways. In some societies, there were expectations about living arrangements, who you lived with, how households were structured. Being unmarried for too long could attract attention, concern, or even penalties, because the idea of an individual living outside the expected pattern was uncomfortable. So the law, once again, tried to guide people back into structure, toward marriage, toward family, toward something recognizable. Now, as we slowly reach the end of this quiet journey through unusual laws, there is a gentle realization. None of these rules existed in isolation. They were all responses to fear, to change, to uncertainty, to the deeply human desire to make life predictable, even when it isn't. And sometimes that led to rules that feel, from where we are now, almost absurd. Counting buttons, regulating sleeves, monitoring dinners, taxing beards, judging animals, supervising love. But at the time, they made sense to someone. They felt necessary, important, even, because every law begins as a solution, a response to something that felt like a problem. And over time, those solutions can become a little detached from reality. But they remain, like quiet echoes, reminders of what people once worried about, what they tried to control, what they thought mattered most. So as we gently step away from this world of very specific rules and carefully measured lives, it's worth noticing how familiar some of it feels. Not the details, perhaps, but the instinct to define, to regulate, to create order out of something messy. And maybe that's the most consistent pattern of all. Not the laws themselves, but the need behind them, soft, persistent, and always just a little bit hopeful that this time things will stay neatly in place, which, of course, they rarely do. Let's begin somewhere underneath a castle, not the grand halls, not the decorated chambers with tapestries trying their best to hide cold stone walls. No, we're going lower. Down a narrow staircase that was not designed with comfort in mind. The steps are uneven, slightly damp, the kind that make you instinctively slow down, even if no one told you to. And at the bottom, we arrive at what people like to call a dungeon. Now, the word dungeon has a very dramatic reputation. It brings to mind chains, skeletons, and a general atmosphere of theatrical suffering. And yes, sometimes it was like that. But more often, it was quieter, more mundane, which in its own way is worse. A dungeon was usually just a room, or a series of rooms, built below ground level. Thick walls, minimal light, air that didn't move much, because fresh air apparently was not considered essential for prisoners. Some dungeons were purpose-built, others were more improvised. An old storage room, a forgotten cellar, a space that wasn't being used for anything important, until someone decided it could hold people instead of barrels. Efficiency once again. Now, let's imagine the experience of arriving here. You've been brought down those stairs, maybe by guards who are not particularly interested in conversation. The door closes behind you, and the first thing you notice is the sound, or rather, the lack of it. Dungeons tend to absorb noise. Thick stone does that. It makes everything feel slightly distant. Even your own movements sound muted, which means time starts to feel strange. Days blur. Light is limited, sometimes just a small opening high in the wall, a window that is less about looking out and more about reminding you that the outside world still exists. Some dungeons had no windows at all, just darkness. Now, not everyone in a dungeon was there for the same reason. This is where things get a bit socially interesting, because just like everything else in history, your experience depended heavily on who you were. If you were a noble, or at least someone of importance, your dungeon stay might be slightly upgraded. You might have a larger room, some furniture, perhaps even a servant allowed to bring food, because status does not completely disappear when you are imprisoned. It just gets a little damp. There are cases of nobles being held in relatively comfortable confinement, rooms with fireplaces, access to books, occasional visits, which feels less like a dungeon and more like an extremely inconvenient hotel. But if you were not a noble, things were different, much simpler, and by simpler I mean less space, less light, less attention. You might be sharing the room with others, or not. Both options come with their own kind of discomfort. Because solitude can be heavy, but so can proximity to strangers who are also not having a great time. Now, let's talk about chains, because yes, they were used, but not always in the dramatic way you might imagine. Sometimes prisoners were chained to walls, sometimes to the floor, sometimes not at all. It depended on how dangerous they were considered, or how much effort the guards were willing to put in that. Restraints were practical. They limited movement, reduced escape attempts, and, perhaps most importantly, required less supervision. Because if someone cannot move very far, you don't have to watch them as closely. Now, food, always an important topic. Dungeon food was not exactly curated. You were given enough to survive. Usually, bread, water, occasionally, something more. The quality depended on the resources of the castle and the priorities of the people in charge, which means that for some prisoners, meals were just something that happened, not something to look forward to, and certainly not something to enjoy. Time in a dungeon was not structured. There were no schedules, no activities, no sense of progression, just waiting, which, as it turns out, is one of the more difficult things for the human mind to handle, because without markers, time stretches. It becomes soft, unreliable. Days feel longer or shorter, or both at once. Now, let's gently shift toward the purpose of these spaces, because dungeons were not always about punishment. Sometimes they were about holding, temporary containment, waiting for trial, waiting for a decision, waiting for someone important to make up their mind, which could take a while, because medieval administration was not known for its speed. So you might find yourself in a dungeon not because your fate had been decided, but because it hadn't yet. And that uncertainty becomes its own kind of weight. Now, let's float over to a specific kind of dungeon, the oubliette. A word that sounds almost elegant. It comes from the French oublier, meaning to forget, which gives you a hint about its purpose. An oubliette was typically a vertical shaft, a narrow space, often accessible only from above. You would be lowered in, and that was it. No door, no easy exit, just a small opening far above. It was not designed for frequent visits, or for comfort, or for conversation. It was designed to be final, in a quiet, administrative kind of way. Now, not every castle had one, and they were not used constantly. But the concept itself tells you something about how imprisonment could be approached, out of sight, out of mind, quite literally. Now, let's gently bring in a person, because dungeons are not just spaces, they are experiences, and those experiences belong to individuals. One well-known example is Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France. Then, Queen of England, a woman with a very long list of titles, and an equally long list of opinions, which, as it turns out, was not always appreciated. At one point, she supported a rebellion against her husband, King Henry II, which is a bold move. And Henry responded in a way that feels both predictable and slightly passive-aggressive. He imprisoned her, not in a dark, forgotten pit, but in various castles, under guard, for about 16 years. Now, this is not a typical dungeon story. Eleanor was high status. She was not chained in a damp cell, but she was confined, her movement restricted, her influence limited, which, for someone used to power, is its own kind of discomfort. And again, we see the pattern. Imprisonment is not one single experience. It changes depending on who you are, what you've done, and who is making the decisions. Now, let's slowly drift back to the more ordinary prisoners, the ones without titles, without influence. For them, dungeons were less about politics and more about survival, endurance, waiting. Sometimes, hope. sometimes not. And yet, even in these conditions, life continued in small ways. People talked, if they could, shared stories, remembered things. Because the mind, even in confinement, keeps moving, it has to. Now, as we sit quietly in this dim space, something becomes clear. Dungeons were not always dramatic, not always loud. Often, they were defined by stillness, by repetition, by the slow passing of time in a place designed to hold people in between decisions. And that in between is important, because a dungeon is not just about being locked away. It is about being paused, removed from the normal flow of life, set aside and left there, sometimes briefly, sometimes for years, sometimes long enough that the outside world changes without you. So as we slowly step back up those narrow stairs, leaving the cool air and thick silence behind, we carry that sense of quiet with us. Because what happened in castle dungeons was not always dramatic, but it was deeply human, and often deeply lonely. Now, let's move on, because not all dungeons were just about waiting. Some were about questioning, and that is where things become a little more intentional, not louder, not faster, just more deliberate, which somehow makes it even quieter. So now we ease into a slightly different use of the dungeon, not just a place for waiting, but a place for asking questions, very persistent questions. Because at some point, authorities realized that simply holding people was not always enough. They also wanted information, confessions, agreements, something that could neatly close a case and allow everyone involved to feel finished. And this is where interrogation comes in. Now, it's important to keep expectations calm here. This was not always dramatic, not always shouting and chaos. In fact, it was often slow, methodical, repetitive, which in its own way is more exhausting. A prisoner would be brought into a chamber, sometimes still within the dungeon area, sometimes a nearby room designed specifically for this purpose. A table, a chair, a few officials, and then the questions begin. Simple at first. Name, background, details of whatever situation brought them here. And if the answers were not satisfactory, the process continued, again and again, because the goal was not just to ask, it was to wear down, gently, consistently, until resistance became. Seeing now, not all interrogations involved physical methods. That's a common assumption. But often, psychological pressure was enough. Isolation played a big role. When you spend long periods alone, your thoughts start to shift. Certainty becomes less certain. Memory feels softer. And when someone finally comes in and asks questions, there's a strange relief, even if those questions are not particularly friendly, because interaction, any interaction, breaks the silence. And that can be enough to change how someone responds. Now, of course, there were also more direct methods, and we'll talk about them gently, without turning the volume up too much. Because even here, things were often procedural. There were devices, tools, each with a purpose, not random, not chaotic, but designed with a kind of quiet intention. The goal was not always to cause harm, at least not in the way people might imagine. The goal was to create discomfort, to encourage cooperation, which is a very careful way of describing something that was not pleasant, and yet in many legal systems of the time, this was considered acceptable, even necessary, because a confession was seen as the strongest form of evidence. If someone admitted to something, the case was complete. neat, resolved. So the system was built to produce confessions, and dungeons became part of that system. Now, let's pause briefly on something interesting. Confessions obtained this way were not always reliable, which might sound obvious now, but at the time, it was less widely acknowledged. If enough pressure is applied, people will say many things, not necessarily true things, but things that end the situation, which creates a strange loop. A system designed to find truth, producing statements shaped by circumstance. And yet, the process continued, because it fit the structure. It provided answers, even if those answers were complicated. Now let's gently move to a specific setting. The Tower of London. A place that has quietly seen many versions of this story. Over the centuries, it functioned as a fortress, a palace, and yes, a prison. And beneath its more impressive structures, there were spaces used for holding and questioning prisoners. People of all kinds passed through here. Nobles, political figures, religious dissenters, each with their own story, each with their own version of events. One such figure was Guy Fawkes. Now, we won't get into dramatic detail. We'll keep the tone calm. But after his involvement in the gunpowder plot, he was brought to the tower and questioned extensively. At first, he resisted, maintained his position. But over time, under pressure, his responses changed. His signature, recorded at different stages, tells a quiet story. At the beginning, it is firm, clear. Later, less so. A small detail, but one that reflects the process. Now, again, this was not unique. Many people went through similar experiences. Some held their ground, some did not. And the dungeon, in these cases, was not just a space. It was part of a system. A place where decisions were shaped, where outcomes were influenced, where the line between truth and survival could become blurred. Now, let's gently shift away from the formal side of things towards something more everyday, because not every prisoner in a dungeon was part of a grand political event. Some were there for smaller reasons. Local disputes, minor crimes, situations that escalated, just enough to involve authority. For these individuals, the dungeon was less about interrogation and more about inconvenience, a holding space, pause in their normal life. They might be there for a few days, a week, long enough to feel the disruption, short enough that the outside world remained familiar. And when they left, they carried that experience with them, a memory of the cold, the quiet, the waiting. Now, here's something that often gets overlooked. The people who worked in these spaces, the guards, the officials, the ones who moved through the dungeon regularly. For them, this was not an unusual environment. It was part of their routine. They walked those corridors daily, opened and closed those doors, delivered food, escorted prisoners. And over time, what feels heavy to an outsider becomes normal, which is a strange but very human adaptation, because people adjust, even to places like this. Now, let's slowly bring in another quiet detail. Communication. Despite the isolation, people in dungeons sometimes found ways to connect, through walls, through small openings, through shared spaces. Messages could be passed, stories exchanged, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to remind each other that they were not completely alone. And that matters, even in the smallest way. Now, as we sit with all of this, the dungeon becomes something slightly different from the image we started with. It is not just a place of darkness, it is a place of process, of systems, of human interaction. However limited, it holds stories, not all of them dramatic, some of them very quiet, almost ordinary. And that ordinariness is what makes it feel real, because history is not always loud. Sometimes it is just steady. A series of small moments, repeated day after day, in a space that does not change very much. So as we gently step away from the questioning rooms and the slow rhythm of interrogation, we move toward the final part of this story, where we look at what happened after the waiting, after the questions, after the doors eventually opened, or didn't, because leaving a dungeon, as it turns out, was not always the end of the story. Sometimes it was just the beginning of something else, equally quiet, equally strange, and just a little bit unresolved.